Welcome to The Real Business of Wine, our 36th edition. And this one has got one of my old friends from the UK and international wine world, Dan Jago, who has, one always talks about people having unique CVs, but I think in the case of Dan, it really is a unique CV because essentially he's the only person I know who has actually been in the business of selling wine as a supermarket level, selling wine at the fine old London wine merchant level, and you don't get more older and finer than Berry Brothers and Rudd. And before that, having been in the business of actually selling wine to restaurants and independent retailers and so on as a wholesaler at Bibendum, which was one of London's best known distributors, or the UK's best known distributors. So let's kick off, Dan, by just a little bit of scene setting. Initially, you were introduced to booze, I imagine, by your father, Tom Jago, who's a very, very well-known character in the wine and spirits world.
Yeah? Yes, indeed. It seems quite a long time ago, but regular memories of him bringing home sample bottles of various disgusting concoctions and saying, try this. The basic rule in our household being is if my mother didn't like it, it would be a big success. And if she did like it, it wouldn't be, because she had quite peculiar and refined taste.
But I suppose my question there was that your dad was on the one hand a supreme creator of commercially successful drinks, and you can talk a little bit about those, but also he knew a good bottle of wine from a bad one. So I imagine that as in your youth, you saw both sides of the drinks industry at a rather early stage. Is that a fair?
Yeah, very much, very early. I mean, a wonderful man called Martin Bamford, who was a master of wine, a young master of wine, and one of the gang in Bordeaux, was my older brother's godfather. And so I got to stay at Louden when I was about 13. And there was a whole era of growing up around good food, good wine, in a way that was very unacademic. A lot of people have been very academic, shall we say, in their development in wine and their experience and exposure to it. But on the one hand, it was about fun, and on the other hand, for Dad, it was about inventing things in business as well.
And so one of those was a product called Piat d'Or, and the story that I always, and I'd love you to be the first person to demolish this story, because nobody else ever has, was that this was a wine produced for the UK market at a time where Liebfrau milk, Blue Nun, was the popular drink at the time, and consumers were shown a range of red wines, and the red wine they liked best was in fact the Liebfrau milk with red dye, and that was the level of sweetness that was specified for the makers of what actually was a red wine made from red grapes. I don't know how true that was, but that was the stories I was told at the time.
There's enough truth in there to nod. I think the tests were done on white wine dyed red to see whether people liked their sweetness levels. And when the original spec of Piat d'Or Red came out, it was about 24 grams of residual sugar. So it was pretty sweet by today's standards. As Dad always said, people like to talk dry and drink sweet. And that's not that far from the truth even now.
So you then actually, you went from growing up in that world into the Navy.
Yep.
And you were a lieutenant navigator, is that right?
Yeah, navigated ships, got from A to B in a series of straight lines.
Not always, from what I've recalled.
Yeah, mostly we got where we were going. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, and then from there into selling wine at the not the lowest level, but at the turning up with bottles and samples into restaurants and places and saying, can I sell you this, put it on your wine list? Yes?
Yeah, there was,
was that your...
Going back, I mean, I delivered wine for a small London old school retailer called Andre Seymour Wines when I was 16. And I then went into the Navy, and when I left the Navy aged 26 or 7, I ended up back in the wine trade again and selling to the London city clubs and institutions and Oxbridge colleges and all sorts of restaurants and hotels as well. So and really enjoyed it. When I first started, I asked my then boss what a salesman was, because I was offered a job as a salesman. I said, what does a salesman really do? And he said, as long as you've got an ego and a pair of shoes, you'll be fine. And that sort of summed it up pretty much.
But in terms of wine knowledge, you didn't go in sort of with all sorts of WSET credentials, did you, at that point?
No, far from it. In fact, I went in, did a few WSET exams fairly early on, got bored halfway through my diploma. So I've got part A, as it was in those days, but not part B. So I consider myself sort of 50% qualified. But most of it has been entirely about going and seeing places, tasting with winemakers, listening and learning.
So then we'll skip forward, but basically Bibendum, the little picture in the middle, was this quite young, go-ahead business, which was really a lot of wines from everywhere, but particularly Europe and New World coming through. And as I said earlier, that was very much the sort of the restaurant specialist retail business, but there are also some brands involved. And I'm interested in how we get into the whole brand business and distribution business. Because I was thinking about things like Argento and things like that came up.
Yeah, I mean,
Bibendum, didn't they?
Bibendum was an amazing business in an amazing era. I mean, there was a relatively low level of direct competition. There were very good merchants out there. It was the heyday of the Haynes Hanson Clark. People like Liberty were beginning to grow. These are UK merchant businesses who tended to specialize in their area. And Bibendum didn't have that much competition. So I started off doing corporates, as I had done at Leighton's. I then moved on to join the agency side. So I set up a division selling to supermarkets. And it was very quickly the case that supermarkets generally didn't know what they wanted. And if you came to them with a good idea, they would buy it. So we quite quickly started saying, we need more good ideas. And people like Simon Farr, who was sort of pretty legendary of his generation, had a lot of good ideas. And these would very quickly be converted into something on a bottle, which we would take in to see a supermarket buyer. And it was before the days of half price. It was before the days of really well-established brands. And the most established brand was generally the supermarket's own name, which was on a label as own label, or a series of peripheries around the edges. I mean, the likes of Penfolds existed, and they were strong in the supermarkets, but there were no preeminent brands in the wine world, and you could argue there still aren't. But we started creating wines which were able to meet the needs of the supermarket and quite quickly turn them into things that would sell in decent volumes. And I think that was epitomized by, on the one hand, Argento, which was a very genuine product, groundbreaking, modern, new world wine from Argentina, produced by a visionary man in Nicholas Catena, right the way through to the other end, where we created great with. And we had great with chicken and great with fish and great with beef. And we literally found the wine wherever we could. As long as it was a Colombard Chardonnay from South Africa or a Chenin Blanc from the Loire, it was fine. And we sold that to supermarkets, and that worked extremely well. And those were really decent volumes.
Now, I remember at the time, because this is really a fascinating part of the story for me, that the divisiveness of that Great With project, because on the one hand, you had the consumers buying into it very happily through the supermarkets, and on the other hand, you had what Blake Gray, whom we were talking to on Friday from the US, talking about the wine intelligentsia, saying, oh, how can you say great with pasta? You know, what kind of pasta? Was it pasta with mussels or pasta with this? Which was missing, as I saw it, missing the point completely. And that was effectively not a brand, or was it a brand? Where would you place it in the
No, it was categorically not a brand.
Label? Was it a brand?
It was a label.
Exactly.
No, well, it definitely wasn't a brand. It was a label that was exclusive to one retailer at the time, that was designed to make wine a little less complicated. And that, I think, has been the aim for many wine importers, brand creators for a long time. The danger becomes when you start calling a label a brand. And I think that crossover line, the confusion between the two, has been an ongoing saga for a long time. But that was definitely not a brand. It was just an idea.
We're going to come. I'm going to come back to that because I think it's very central to what we're going to be talking about. But why can a product like Great With, why does it have a limited lifespan? Why can I not walk into a store today and buy it?
Because of the one thing I use again and again when trying to explain wine to people in a retail environment is this thing called infinite substitution. And infinite substitution has always been, for me, the thing that holds you back in this industry, is that no matter what you put on the shelf, there'll be something else available either side of it, normally for 20 meters either side of it, which will do the same job. So once you've tried something and you said, well, that's okay, I like that, but there must be something better out there, you then explore in a supermarket into this era of infinite substitution. If you go and see a wine merchant in the country, of which there are many brilliant ones, it's unlikely they'll tell you to buy the same thing every time you go in. They'll want you to explore and discover. And supermarkets are doing a version of that. And customers are very easily persuaded. They've generally got 5 favorites, and they will know those wines, they will trust those wines, they will engage with them. But they'll always be looking for something else. And I think the idea of a combination of 1,200 SKUs, which is what we were at our peak in Tesco, combined with 5 or 10 facings of each, makes an awful lot of bottles on the shelf, plus a huge amount of promotion, also designed to attract people in. You end up with too much choice, perhaps.
Can I go back there? Because that's an interesting, you've been involved with the WSET in terms of wine education over the years. I've always wondered whether our whole focus on education isn't a rod for our own backs. If you're selling beer, you don't necessarily want, if you're Heineken or you're Carlsberg or whatever, do you want to educate people into exploring lots of other beers? Are you not happy to have them actually find a favourite and stick with it, as you've just said? Aren't we encouraging people away from what might be stronger brands?
Potentially, but beer doesn't educate you. If you think wine is fragmented and myopic, then beer education is right at the outside end of that world, along with Scotch whisky.
Does that matter?
No, it doesn't matter in the slightest.
I mean, my point about that, I'm being a devil's advocate, obviously, but in Scotch whisky, you find there are the geeks who like their malts, but there are the others who just go for the Johnny Walker they know.
Absolutely right. And I think wine education is as much a way of the trade getting a sense of progression, which is a very valuable part of it. I think the ability to be able to say, I have studied, I have done my exams, I am qualified in some way or another, in such an enormous industry. If you think about the total combination of people in the on and off trade around the world, that's a huge number of people. And particularly in markets where there is no established credibility, I think wine education, particularly the WSET and the Master of Wine, gives you a really clear level of performance. And you can see that the Guild of Master Sommeliers has grown enormously in the past few years for the same reasons. So I don't think that's educating necessarily the public. I think that's educating the trade, and that's incredibly valuable. People who want to learn a bit more just happen to be more numerous in the wine world than they are in whiskey or beer.
Now let's leap forward, because we're going to Tesco. So after Bibendum, you suddenly land this, not suddenly, but you land this job, which at the time was either the biggest wine buyer in the world or competing with the LCBO and I think Costco or whatever, but certainly up there as being
much bigger,
right at the top. Then you've got products like Oggio. Mm-hmm. And Oggio to me is a fascinating brand, product, private label, and that's what we may talk about. If I went into a Tesco store, there was this beautifully packaged bottle, packaged by a mutual friend of both of ours, mm-hmm. Which, as far as the consumer was concerned, it didn't say brought to you by Tesco anywhere visibly on it. The only thing was that it was only available in Tesco, mm-hmm. but it was behaving like a brand, was it not, as far as the consumer was concerned?
As far as supermarket retailing of wine is concerned, it was behaving like a brand within that context. But bear in mind, there was no advertising above the line for that product. It was only ever communicated to the trade, and then only as a way of saying you can't have it. And it was basically available within Tesco on a regular promotional cycle. And it started off with just a Pinot Grigio, and it quite quickly expanded into about 6 or 7 different SKUs. And because it was so regularly promoted and because we gave it so much space, we, the retailer, decided that we wanted that to be a well-known wine. And this is my point about brands. It wasn't a brand. Had it been a product that we decided we would let go into every other retailer in the UK and beyond, and we had put some of the limited profitability behind any supermarket wine into above-the-line advertising and created a consumer awareness of it, I suspect it could have gone on to become a very successful brand, in as much as brands last for a limited period of time in wine until something else comes along and replaces them.
Now that allows me to ask a question on behalf of Adrian Atkinson, who has been both on the distributor side, working for Oddbins and as a buyer, and now working for an Australian wine company called Taylor's. Could you give your views on a retailer's request for exclusivity when the best source of sales for them and their customer is for well-known products? And I just add on to that the interesting difference between, say, Denmark, where if you're in one supermarket, you really don't get into another supermarket very easily, and the UK, where you do have brands across chains, but there is that question of I want it for myself. How do you see that?
Supermarkets are perpetually and permanently in competition with each other. Anything that will allow you to differentiate from your competition in the supermarketing world is an upside. And because supermarkets wield such authority with the consumer in terms of getting them to choose what it is they'll buy and control over, as we now know, 82% of total consumption of wine in the UK goes through the retailers, the big retailers, you find yourself in a very strong position where you say, I don't want to be selling a product that's elsewhere for two reasons. One, as I've highlighted, is because you want a degree of difference. You want a point of difference in exclusivity. But secondly, because the retail industry and supermarketing has always used alcohol in particular, and wine no more than any other category, as a way of driving footfall and as a way of making sure that consumers feel they're getting value. So if you have a product that is widely available in all supermarkets, inevitably somebody will discount it to a point at which you wouldn't like to be selling at. And therefore you are looking for exclusivity as a way of preventing this happening. If you all end up listing exactly the same products, then inevitably, to create your point of difference between retailers, somebody will push it a bit harder than somebody else.
Now that brings me back, and in case you hadn't realized, that the word brand is going to come up quite often on this, as what is the brand? Is it the product on the shelf, or is it the place where you're buying it, the Tesco brand? And that then opens the door to various issues, one of which is the private label brand, which in Tesco's case was Tesco Finest, for example, that you were involved with, which I have all sorts of questions about, because it was a phenomenon. I believe it became the biggest wine brand, or possibly other food brand, I'm not sure, in the UK, but it wasn't always finest of anything. By definition, it couldn't be. But the other question is, in terms of the breadth of a chain like Tesco, how far can you go? Because you tried to bring in top-end Bordeaux's at a time where you've got the Lidls and Aldis biting at your heels at the other end of the scale. How broad can a brand like Tesco be?
Pretty broad, on the basis that it represents 17 million households in the UK. I think you'll find it's pretty capable of extending from the very top to the very bottom. Now, as we now know, there is a very small market at the very top for wine in supermarkets. I happened to go both feet first into the idea of buying en primeur when I was at Tesco. Unfortunately, I did it in the 2009 and 2010 vintages, which proved to be never more expensive. So we got our fingers burnt on that, but we introduced customers to another service that a retailer could offer. And I think it was a particularly notable part of the brand Tesco that wine added to, was this ability to be able to encompass the needs and expectations and ambitions of a huge number of customers. And one of the challenges is, if you spend your life, and we can come on to talk about what it's like in other countries as well, but if you spend your life trying to be perceived as the lowest common denominator, then the best version of the lowest common denominator isn't very far up the spectrum. And the lower you go, the lower the profitability is, inevitably. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, I want a spread of customers. And that's where Finest was so powerful and so effective, was that we were actually able to sell it for a reasonable price, which meant over £6 in those days. We were able to sell it for a reasonable price with a relatively low level of discount, and we were able to put a really cracking wine in the bottle that cemented the customer's trust in us as a brand and a retailer. And I think that's consistently been the theme of retailer-owned brands, is to find a way of establishing trust. And I always believed at Tesco that our Finest had to be a better version than you could widely find elsewhere of the similar product at the price it was sold for. Because you asked me what the definition of Finest was, and it's about like the definition of brand. I don't know the answer. We haven't got enough time. But I do know that Tesco's Finest was the best version we could find anywhere in the world of that product in the volumes we needed it for, at a price at which people were prepared to pay for it.
Now we come back to that. You talked about other countries. If we were, and Tesco's is talking to Carrefour these days, if we looked at a French chain, they have this phenomenon called the foire à vin, in which people who might never buy wine in a supermarket at any other time of the year, or certainly not buy very much, go into Leclerc or Carrefour or whichever, or Casino, and stock up on the Bordeaux's and the other things that chain has bought. And we had Jane Anson here talking the other day about just how much Bordeaux those chains buy every single year. But it's not just Bordeaux, it's across the board. That was never something that we were able to do in the UK in the same way. But you did start Tesco wine fairs as events that took people outside the stores.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, one of the things I've learned, and when we were at Tesco, was we had at one stage 13 countries where we were selling wine in, and I was being involved in either a small way or a bigger way to help find those wines. One thing we learned very quickly was that no two countries have the same ideal of buying in wine. Everybody does it in a slightly different way, and what's fatal is to try and assume that because it sells like this here, that it'll sell like that there. And there's only 22 miles separating us and France, but the psychology of why and how you buy wine couldn't be more different. That said, the French sell wine a lot more cheaply than we do. And if you look at the average price of a bottle on promotion in a French supermarket, pro rata, excluding obviously duty and VAT and all the burdens that we carry here, it's an incredibly inexpensive product. And it's the way that the French producers, particularly the cooperatives, clear an enormous amount of their stock at a very low margin at very high volumes through the big French supermarkets. And they sell in bulk. The French are quite happy to buy 12 bottles a week of the same product and go in and buy it again and again. But if you look in, for instance, northern France during the foire au vin, where they sell a lot of Cru Classé Bordeaux, for instance, there's a lot of quite grand wine comes out of the chateaux and negociants that goes into these foire au vin. There are Belgians coming down from north of the border and filling up enormous Mercedes estates with 20, 30, 40 cases of wine at foire au vin, and they're doing it twice a year. So there is a different mentality of buying. It's the way that the mechanics of supermarkets work in different countries. And that does bring you on is that the UK market generally is forced down by its consumer in price. Customers don't want to be told in the UK to pay more for something that they feel they should be spending a bit less on. And that's a fundamental rule of the UK market for the majority of customers. There is always a very small slice who are happy to go out and buy expensive cheese and sourdough loaves and shop at their local independent merchants. The local independent merchant will scream and shout and say, supermarkets are all evil. But for the majority of customers, they would like to spend a bit less on a bottle of wine than they have to. And that's the nature of the market. You go to the US, and generally people regard something that sells for a bit less as being wrong, and it should be selling for a bit more because it says the right thing about me if people know that I spent $50 on this bottle.
Well, I think that's fascinating. You've taken me exactly down that road that I was looking at going, because you could argue that Germany and Poland, where you had stores, for example, there is also certainly, and Holland is the other market, there's definitely a cheapskate reputation. But in Germany, the lawyer or the businessman in Berlin or in Munich on a Saturday night might buy a much more expensive bottle. He might spend 2 or 3 times the price of his Wednesday night bottle. Whereas in the UK, his counterpart tends to have a smaller range, it seems to me, and that seems to be the experience that Direct Wines and some of the companies that are both that operate across the world is concerned. In other words, how do you get the Brit to actually go outside, to push the envelope to spending more on special occasions?
It's a really interesting question, because I suspect deep down we know too much about wine in the UK market. We've been doing it for too long. We've been the epicenter of wine trading for such a long time. If you go to a market like South Korea, the exploration and the ambition and the desire to learn a bit more, to try something better, to be seen to be spending something on a great bottle of wine, or the perception of a great bottle of wine, is really powerful. Whereas over here, we've sort of become a bit blasé about it. And sort of, you saw this very much in some of my jobs in the early days at Bibendum and the later days at Berries. You had a lot of customers who knew an enormous amount of about wine, who collected wine because they loved it, because they were excited by it, because they felt that this was something that was an intellectual study. And what you found is that we've lost some of the excitement over why this bottle is more interesting, why this bottle is more exciting. Though that said, we still have a large and very healthy wine market in the UK. We should never forget that for 58, 59, 60 million people, of which give or take 25% don't drink, and some of those are below drinking age, and you've got a relatively small group of people, and we sell an enormous amount of pretty smart wine to those people. We've been the largest importing market in the world by value for a very long time, until the US overtook us. Germany used to beat us by volume, and we beat them by value. And now the US has overtaken on both fronts. But we sold a vast amount of grand wine. We were the most important wine market in the world for a very long time, for the reasons that we were able to sell pretty much everything, from £3 Hirondelle right up to £300 Lafite.
I'm not going to let you off you raised the question of discounting. And I think before we move on to anywhere else, and this is before the arrival of the quote unquote discounters, we kind of, my memory is that we adopted the discounting model from Australia rather than anywhere else, probably back in the 90s. But the idea of deep discounting and buy one, get one free, or 3 for a price, or whatever, and of promotions that were effectively paid for by the brands, did that not actually screw with the heads of the consumers, where they actually have no idea what the right price of a bottle of wine is, because every time they go into the store, it's a different price. And that doesn't matter whether it's an Oggio private label, or it's a Hardy's, or a Lindemans, or whatever the brand was.
I think hindsight would say that the arrival of the European discounters and an EDLP strategy, whereby everything is the lowest possible price you can get it to with no promotion, and the very quick acceptance of that pricing model by consumers, would tell you, yes, it did confuse people in hindsight, and it would have been much better to have just done one price. And it's, you know, very, very interesting that what was then about 4.5–5% of the UK grocery market, i.e. Lidl and Aldi, managed to convert the entire rest of the grocery market's pricing models. So a small German retailer, not small at all, but small in the UK, came in and completely changed the pricing structure of the UK market, of the big 4, the big 5, and I think forever. But at the time, and in fact, I think I was probably partly responsible. I seem to remember, ask Alan Cheeseman, who used to be the head of buying at Sainsbury's in the early days. I think I brought them the first ever half-price deal, which was a Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon, where we half-priced it from $4.99 from our friends in Curacao. And so it was an extraordinary deal. And I think it started a period where customers felt that wine was expensive, but they would be able to buy it less expensively. And I think the psychology around half-price deals worked well for a large period of its time. I think it then got into trouble where ultimately everybody was half-pricing, plus 25% off if you bought 6 bottles, and you ended up with mutually assured destruction. You had every retailer trying to out half-price each other, and eventually you had to pull the plug on it. And I was very pleased to still be at Tesco when we did pull the plug on it and said no more half prices. And it was a sort of sigh of relief from everybody that we're no longer going to have to go out and find wine that's probably better than it should be, price it at a certain position, then half price it, where we would quite often, and you know, this won't come as a surprise to anybody, lose money doing half price offers, in the same way that any major promotion on alcohol quite often did lose money for the retailer, but it was part of a marketing mix.
I've got a question from Lorenzo Biscontin, who used to be with Santa Margherita and is a consultant, marketing consultant in Italy. Interesting point that UK consumers want to spend a little less than they could in a bottle of wine. Do you think that the substitution of Pinot Grigio with Prosecco, in other words, moving from Pinot Grigio to Prosecco by many UK consumers, shows that they are willing to pay a bit more if they see value? Or is it because Prosecco is a different kind of product?
I think the whole perception of value is changing really quickly, or relatively quickly in wine terms, because we've seen it on a number of areas. And I've watched things like Provence Rosé, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, Prosecco, and a number of other things suddenly gain traction. And the price becomes initially very inexpensive and quite promotionally driven, which is what Prosecco was doing. I mean, Plaza, which was the biggest Prosecco brand, if it's not still in the UK, which was Tesco own label or exclusive label, we did 4 million bottles in 3 days at Christmas one year. That's quite a lot of bottles of Prosecco, but that was at £6. So I think now that Prosecco's got a little bit more expensive, people are prepared to follow that trend. And if you look at rosé now, for instance, particularly Provence Rosé, which is still the sort of the granddaddy of the category and leads the category in rosé, you're seeing that the average price is getting on towards £15 now for a wine that costs very little to produce. But there has been, through things like Whispering Angel and Miraval, a real strength added to the value of the proposition. So you've ended up with a wine that you should be drinking, you should be seen drinking, tastes very nice, is very easy, Bob's your uncle. If you can get away with charging £15 and everybody else is charging £50, then good on you.
Now, there's a parallel there in a way, but obviously at a lower level with New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, in the sense of a relatively high price for a relatively inexpensive product to produce. But you could say that the model of the British supermarket in particular, where on the one hand we want to buy it at the lowest possible price, and on the other hand we historically wanted those producers to fund promotions of one kind or another, meant that they didn't have the money, the margin, to create brands with any strength, which then comes back to your point of the infinite substitutability.
You broke up at the end there. I got to the infinite.
My point is that our brands are weaker than they would be in the States, for example, where in the States producers have more margin because they're not necessarily selling through supermarkets who are driving them down to quite the same extent. And they can actually spend some money on building the strength of those brands, which justifies higher prices.
Yes and no. I mean, the US market's a lovely market, a three-tier system designed to prevent control by the mafia of the alcohol industry post-prohibition has turned into 3 times 30% margin, and everybody does extremely well out of it. Thank you very much. And were there a sort of semi-legislated 3-tier system in the UK, I think we'd be in a very different place. But we wouldn't be selling nearly as much as wine as we have done in the past. I think that, yes, it's very hard to create a brand in wine. I think production costs are generally high. I think the margins to producers selling in volume are generally low. And the margins that retailers make on wine and alcohol generally are pretty low too. So there's not much left in there. There's not much skin left in the game for anybody to create a brand. And trying to create a brand outside of a retail environment basically requires you to take a punt on it. You've got to go out and find some money from elsewhere, put it into your brand and hope that that will pay returns on it. It is possible to do. There have been plenty of brands like Kamala where you start with actually a relatively inexpensive product, a simple label, and you invest a fair amount of money above the line and you grow the brand pretty quickly from there. And it worked very well. It certainly worked very well for Western wines, judging by the sales price of the business. But that's the brand they bought. But that brand is basically no longer in existence.
Now we could jump from the supermarket. Let's leave the supermarket world for a second, and then just move across to the other world of Berry Brothers and Rudd, which would seem, on the face of it, to be two entirely different parts of town, crossing the tracks, as it were. So, but when you went to Berry Brothers, 300-year-old company, but not in the best of financial health at the time. It had some spirits brands that it had actually disposed of, that I think were quite profitable, had been quite profitable at the time. So what is your approach when you arrive at a company like Berry's with your background from Bibendum and Tesco? What was the first on your to-do list there?
I think by that stage, I'd realized that I enjoyed the business of wine more than wine itself. And I think that's quite important to understand. I think there's a fairly important difference and separation between the two. I discovered that actually I enjoyed the way that the industry worked. I enjoyed the way the wine industry worked. I enjoyed helping people to do a better job than they could do without somebody guiding them. I enjoyed the financial side of making businesses understand what it cost and what you sold it for and what the difference in between was called, and the fact that you couldn't do anything unless you had profit. But Berry's was an unusual scenario because it was a very asset-rich business. It had still does have a wonderful property portfolio at the bottom of St James's, and a brand which to a group of customers in the UK was irrefutably established. It was a wonderful brand. It was locked and loaded. It was been there forever. It was the Queen's wine merchant, and it had one of the nicest shops in the country. And I arrived there thinking, clearly the brand is not my problem. But what I wanted to try and understand was why it was that I knew very little about Berry Brothers, despite having been in the wine trade for 30 years. I knew very little about what it stood for, what it was trying to communicate with its customers. How did it communicate with its customers? Certainly, I'd never had a mail shot from Berry Brothers in my entire time. I'd never had a phone call from anybody at Berry Brothers at Tesco or at Bibendum or anywhere else. And I sort of knew it was out there, but I didn't know an awful lot about it. And I think the thing that really struck me was that it was a very introspective business. I also discovered when I got there, it wasn't actually one business at all. It was 4 or 5 separate businesses, all very divided up, all with their own empires. And so I looked at it from a purely business perspective, nothing to do with wine, and said, how do we make this a more efficient company? And then let's focus on what we do to make it sell more. And that applies to any business. How do you interpret your brand? What is it you're trying to be perceived as? How do you communicate with customers? And how do you engage customers? And then how do you make customers want to come back and do it again? And so those are the basic principles, all at the same time, making sure that you sell more and spend less, because you cannot run a business where you're spending more than you're taking in. So it was a business that I think that knew where it wanted to be. So that part of it was quite straightforward for me. It was a very, very determinedly family-owned private company, and long may it stay that way, because the Berry family and the Rudd family were extraordinary custodians and very, very unusual. 8 generations of Berries, 3 generations of Rudds, and the fact is that they're still getting on after 3 whole generations is remarkable in itself. And they've managed to protect that family heritage. And my job was just to come along and make it a better version of what it already was.
Now, the link between the two, I mean, one of the links between the two was the fact that Tesco's has obviously moved into selling online and had already become, as I recall, Britain's biggest online wine retailer, I think, when you were still there, if I'm correct. But Berry Brothers was one of the first wine merchants in the UK to go online. Yeah. And but I was never certain how much they were doing with that, or how effectively they were doing that in more recent times.
A hell of a lot better than a lot of people, even when I got there. I think Simon Berry started trading on the web in '94, where it was almost, actually at the same time as Tesco started. In fact, 2 years earlier than Tesco started trading on the web, where it was almost done through PFAX in those days, an old form of television-based text and information. And Berry's was determined to be leaders in a number of different areas it operated in. It was determined to make sure if it was going to do something, it would do it really well. And the website was then, and still is, I think, exemplary. One of the things we discovered was that actually, whilst trading participation of the total business through online was very similar to Tesco, you know, it was somewhere around 10%, was that actually the amount of people who went to the website for information, to download data, was enormous. We had a huge swell of sommeliers from the US and from Asia who would go onto the website every day to find out a bit about a region, a chateau, a producer, because it was an incredibly information-rich site. And I always think that was one of the opportunities Berries had, was to be slightly sort of generous with its knowledge. We employed 7 masters of wine at the time when I joined, and we were very generous with the information that we had.
Now that's going one direction. Now, when you were at Tesco, you had this thing called Dunnhumby, or people called Dunnhumby, this extraordinary, the Tesco club card, which every time anybody bought anything on Tesco, you knew who'd bought it and when and where and how. And also, I think you were spending a certain amount of money with companies like Wine Intelligence and others. So the amount of data that Tesco had about its customers was enormous.
Yep.
Did Berry Brothers, I'm sure Berry Brothers knew quite a lot about some of its customers. Did it know as much about its customers as Tesco?
No, far from it. It was not great at that time at knowing why customers did what customers did and whether they did it again. And that was one of the key features, I think, at the time I was there. I brought in a girl, funnily enough, from Tesco, who'd been in marketing and strategy and buying, called Hannah Crabtree, as the marketing director at Berries. And Hannah's still there as managing director of private clients. And turning that business into a data-centric business that had the tools and the capability to understand, react to, and to actively engage customers was a core part of what we tried to do. Because everything from simple CRM, from customer relationship management, right the way through to being able to proactively act upon customers' actions is critical, I think, to a modern business. And even in the business I've now joined, e-commerce, knowing what's happening with data, how to use that data to make sure that the journey of a customer is seamless and you don't drop the ball when passing it between parts of the business, is essential.
So yes, that's a fascinating area in the sense of what Berries or Tesco is to the consumer, but also what is the wine to the consumer. So we had Maggie Enriques here from Krug a week ago, and we were talking about luxury wine. And I'm interested to know when I'm looking at the Berry Brothers list, I've got all these Burgundies and a whole range of Côte Rôties and Hermitages and so on. And I happen to know this producer or this vintage. And so I'm drilling down and I'm looking for the best value at that level, for example. But there are other people perhaps who are looking at basically they want to show off. They want to buy the biggest, shiniest toy they can get. Was that something that you found interesting when you were at Berries, that line of why people are buying some of the wines they're buying at the top end?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly we had to realize that our customers were segmented into distinctive groups. And we found that 15% of our customers, but only 15%, would buy purely for investment. So they were buying with no other purpose at all, apart from the fact it was going to make money. And buying wine with its tax benefits was a really clever way of making money. And if you started buying in really the first of the en-primeur vintages back in 82, but if you started buying anywhere between 80 and about 95, you had made money on wine. It was as simple as that, pretty much anything you bought. And if you'd bought well and you'd got on the list of things you were allowed to buy, you'd made a lot of money. So we had that group of customers. We then had a group of customers which was much more important on the private client side. About 60% of customers bought for a combination of they wanted it to go up in value so that they could potentially sell it, but they also want to be able to drink it. And that lovely bracket, which I find the most exciting in fine wine, is the drink one, sell one world, with the idea being is you buy 2 cases, after 10 or 15 years, you sell one of them and that paid for the other one. So you were drinking for free. And if you started some time ago, that was entirely possible to do. I think if you start these days, much more difficult. And increasingly, the producers in all parts of the world, not just in Bordeaux, are starting to say, or have been saying for 5 or 6 years now, we would like a much bigger slice of the upside. You know, we don't see why the consumer should take all of the upside. So therefore, we're going to have to hold back a bit more stock so that we see some of the upside if the price goes up. We're going to have to release a little bit more expensively than you think it should be released at. We don't think that Prima is necessarily all it's cut out to be, and we'd like the prices to be much higher than they were. Right the way down to some producers in Burgundy who are sitting there saying, look, I've got a bottle of wine that I've always sold for €100 a bottle on Prima when it came out. But the minute I sell it, it's worth €2,500. And I don't want to sell it for more than 100 because I feel guilty doing it, but I don't want somebody else to take €2,400 worth of profit. So what do I do with this bottle? And it's causing turmoil, I think, as speculation has taken over the ability to be able to do that buy one, drink one, sell one market that we've had for such a long time. If there is no upside in it for the consumer, then I think it's in danger of grinding to a halt. Unless, of course, you have a whole load of new consumers, as we have done from Asia and from the Far East generally, and also from the US and from Silicon Valley, coming in and saying, I just want to own these wines, and I don't really mind what it costs. And that's driven real health in the secondary market.
But in a way, of course, if you go back 20 or 30 years, a business like Berry Brothers would have held a lot more old wine in its cellars. It would have done some of this work. And that, when we went through the periods of high interest rates and inflation and so on, that's when that stopped. And the merchant became having a smaller hold on.
Yeah, and when accountants explained this term called the inventory cost of capital, and they explained it to everybody in the wine industry, because up till now, nobody really understood that you had to make money out of wine or it was anything other than something fun to have. And, you know, an enormous amount of people in the wine trade have never made any money, but they've had an extraordinarily lovely life out of it, ranging from living above the shop for your country wine merchant and putting all of your expenses onto the business is one end of it. And the other end of it is that you sell the wine at the best price you can for as long as you can if you're a producer. And then at the end of the season, you dump it all on a French supermarket and you start all over again. So those days have gone, and holding stock requires you to have made a lot of money in the past.
Now, there's two things. One is you've talked in the past, when you were at Tesco, you said, bring me innovation. And there are various people who said, yeah, but it never kind of hit the shelves. And I've got a question from Agatha Pereira saying, question on sustainability. The entire range, you've seen an entire range of consumers across the industry, from those who buy a bottle of wine for £4 to those who spend over 400 on a single bottle. They all have one thing in common. Everybody likes heavy glass bottles, or not even heavy glass bottles, but glass bottles. Why is it so difficult to change perception and behavior about bottle weight, wine sold in box, or indeed other packaging and other sizes?
Did you just make this question up, BJ?
Because, no, it's in the chat. You can see it.
This is one of your pet subjects. I just assumed you'd steer this back onto a pet subject.
No, it's from Agatha Pereira. You can
Why
see
does everything come in the same package? And it's a really good question.
Yeah.
The fact is that the 75cl glass bottle that weighs at a minimum 300 grams and a maximum just over a kilo still does exactly the same job. It does its job really well, actually. It's a really good inert container that you can seal quite easily, that in general is recyclable at the end of it, and can keep it for a long time. You know, there's not much wrong with the glass bottle, and most of the other technologies that we've looked at so far, we've spent the first 10 years trying to remove the faults in them. Whereas that doesn't seem to be a problem with glass, is glass has very few faults in it inherently. But pouches haven't really worked. Bag-in-box, in theory, allows you to limit your consumption over a period of time. Bag-in-box was 9% of Tesco's wine sales, so it was still a really important part of the category, but it just wasn't as much as, because people like to regulate, and the great thing about a 75cl bottle of wine is it gives you a known quantity. It's got yay many units of alcohol in it, and if I have that much of the bottle, I know I feel like this, and if I have that much of the bottle, I know I feel like that, and therefore I can regulate quite easily. Whereas if you then start talking about, and this, interestingly, this is where I have real problems with the idea of legalization of the THC elements of cannabis, is because how do I know how strong it is? Whereas I know what 13% ABV does to me if I drink 3 glasses of wine. And I do think that alternative packaging for wine is going to become more prevalent. I'm particularly fascinated by cans. And I think that cans are, for me, the way ahead. This idea that wine is in some way exclusive and therefore shouldn't be in a can, I'm afraid is snobbery value rather than anything else. A good, light, refreshing wine, sparkling or still in a can, is a terrific concept. But a bit like bag-in-box, it needs to move up the ladder a bit. There's a couple of good ones, but they're very expensive pro rata. So why would you spend a lot of money on 4 small cans of wine when you could spend half the price on the same quality of wine in a bottle? Because it's not...
In the US, that's what they are persuading to the people to do, but not necessarily outside the US. I've got a question about, which going back slightly, but I think it's interesting in terms of consumer behavior. Data. When you were at Tesco, there was this massive data you had. When you were at Berry Brothers, you were creating data. Did you see that data at any point as having a value in itself? In other words, apart from buying and selling bottles of wine, could you have seen that as being a monetizable product?
Well, I think dunnhumby did, the couple who founded the company. Tesco obviously did in a relatively limited sphere to start with, in that if you were a supplier, you could buy dunnhumby data on your product, on your competitors' products. You could find out exactly who bought it and why they bought it and how often they bought it and what else they bought around it. So you could buy all this data, and it was expensive data, that's for sure. So somebody realized that it was valuable, and it brought in quite a lot of money to the Tesco coffers. But I don't think anybody realized quite how valuable data would become. And certainly in my time at Tesco up until 2015, I don't think the penny had properly dropped that big data was potentially more valuable than everything else you do. And I think that people are beginning to realize now that knowing customers and watching businesses, particularly on the West Coast of the States, pay vast amounts of money for data-centric organizations purely for the data is a really interesting model of how we're going to see the future develop. And knowing your customer, knowing what your customer is likely to do is valuable. What I've yet to see is how that data is then converted into making you do something. At the moment, this conversation will mean that I'll get advertisements for wine on my phone later tonight, because something in there is doing an algorithm that's telling them, hey, this guy talks about wine, he must want some wine. But it's going to be a bit yet. It's certainly 3 or 5 years away before it becomes so finely tuned that we can convert the data we've got on customers into a added value for a business to be able to sell their product rather than just the data of their product.
We're going to come on briefly to look at the links between selling fine wine in berries and selling beautiful shotguns at Purdy. But before we do that, there is that point of your experience in the wine business where you no longer are. Absolutely looking at the now, the COVID moment, and as we come out of it, a time where your old business, Bibendum, it's a tough time for them because the restaurants to whom they were going to have been selling lots of wine this time of the year have not been buying wine for obvious reasons, and will those restaurants be coming back to do so? And the independents, some of them have done quite well during this time. In the area of the English countryside where you and I live, there are some quite dynamic local merchants. But how do you see the world of wine coming out of the current situation? Do we revert to where we were? And given the fact that we are not going to be in as easy financial times as we might have been otherwise, what does your crystal ball show you?
Hang on, I'll just ask it. I don't know is the answer. Unquestionably, and none of us do. My suspicions are that consumers will be more comfortable spending a bit more on a bottle of wine post-COVID-19 than they were before. And that's based on simply personal experiences that I've now been at home, locked away, not been out apart from on my bike or for a walk for whatever it is now, 8.5 weeks. We've had wine every night with supper. I've been going to all corners of the cellar and finding interesting bottles. I've got a wife who was a wine merchant herself. and not a supermarket buyer, but a Victoria wine buyer. I've got a daughter who's in the wine business as well. And therefore wine for us is every day. But for a lot of people, wine has been one of those things like baking sourdough and cooking that's become really interesting, and one of those things you can do and you can look forward to. And it's become more than a sort of method of getting from children awake to children asleep comfort, for want of a better description. I think the wine will be more, people will be able to sell better wine, and if they don't take advantage of that opportunity, then more for them. I think the restaurant trade will rebound, but not necessarily at the scale that we had before. I think the ability to have the dynamism we've seen in the restaurant trade, particularly in the UK, for the last 10 years is going to be very difficult, because there won't be people with the money to be able to put into adventurous new openings. And we had far more openings than we could ever have people sitting on tables in London for a long time now. But I do believe that we'll be more comfortable spending time at home. And because we'll be more comfortable spending time at home, we'll look for things that make time at home more pleasurable. So we will continue to do more baking at home. We will continue to do more eating at home. We will continue to buy better bottles of wine to drink at home. And all of that, I think, is going to be to the benefit of the wine industry, and particularly to the independents. Most people I know have used this opportunity to buy online from independents, from established people, to explore new merchants, rather than going and stocking up in supermarkets. And that comes from sort of post-loo roll euphoria, when they didn't have any stock left anyway, because they were taken by surprise and people cleared out everything that lasted more than a week. So suddenly they started looking elsewhere for availability. And my old company, Berries, got absolutely ravaged by customers stocking up early on as quickly as they could, to the point at which they had to shut down to re-establish their ability to be able to get orders out of the door. So fingers crossed, I think the wine industry will be a better place for it. And I hope that's a global phenomenon, because if the tide has gone up just by a few inches, not through global warming on this case, but metaphorically through people being stuck at home and being able to drink better wine, then it's going to be a much better place for it. Not if you're a producer of enormous volumes of ordinary wine from somewhere. That's not going to be a very interesting place to be.
I've learned recently about back timing, which was something I never understood about any part of my life until now. But in fact, the idea of having an hour and getting to the end on time, and we are almost there. That was a great point to finish on, but I'm not quite going to let that happen. Just briefly, moving from selling wine to selling shotguns at very high prices. I mean, one of the big differences is when you were at Berries, you had bottles of good ordinary claret or whatever it was at the affordable level. I don't think Purdy's does do entry level guns to the same extent. You may correct me on this. What are the parallels? What lessons, if any, could you now send back to your former selves from the job that you've been doing most recently at Purdy's? There may not be any, but are there any?
What a very good question. Purdy is part of a group called Richemont. Richemont is owned by a wonderful...
Along with Cartier and all sorts of other...
Yeah, along with Cartier and Van Cleef & Arpels and Montblanc and all sorts of things. Chloe. It's got some lovely brands in the group. And it's owned by Johan Rupert, who also happens to own a lot of vineyards in South Africa, some wonderful vineyards down there. And what my new self would say to my previous self was that if you can make something sufficiently desirable and sufficiently beautiful and handcrafted, and you can create a point of difference for that product, then the world of luxury offers you an extraordinary amount of profitability, potentially. If you look at jewelry, if you look at clothing, if you look at shoes, if you look at lots of product areas, they've managed to create an extraordinarily strong margin. LVMH is the world's largest luxury goods business by a very long way, and they've got a strong wine and spirits portfolio. And what I've seen them do with their wine and spirits portfolio over the last 10 years is pretty remarkable. They've basically taken them and started to treat them like luxury goods. And they are being very, very profitable as a result of it. And I would say don't be scared if you can create something unique of making it much more desirable. Burgundy, Bordeaux, California, lots of parts of the world have started to do that. If you look at, there's regular 50 to 100 pound bottles of wine coming out of South Africa now. So it's possible to do if you create enough unique attraction to that product. And I think that we have spent an awful lot of time trying to say, how can we make this volumetrically widely available and lowest in price? And we've been frightened of profitability.
Thank you very much. That was exactly what I would have asked you to say, and we finished on the minute of 7 o'clock. So thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate your time, your input, your experience, and everything you've shared. I know this is something that a lot of people are going to come back and watch the video of, because there's a lot of conversation starters there. I think people can take these thoughts in all sorts of different directions. And have a great evening for the rest of it. Thank you everyone for being along. If we didn't answer your question, I'm sorry. We got through an awful lot of other stuff. And please come along. We're doing Russia later this week. We're doing influencers at the end of the week. We got an influencer, one of China's top influencers on Friday.
Don't get me started.
We'll talk about China tonight. So you can come back and join in, Dan, if you're all right.
If you still want to stay here until 9 o'clock, let's talk about influencers.
Come back on Friday. We'll definitely do that. And thank you all very much. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Good to see you. Bye all.
Thanks. Bye.